Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polities Podcast. We're so excited you're here, and we're happy to have Pat McGeehan back with us. We are going to be talking about assisted suicide, and we're talking about it especially in the context of a very important election in the state of West Virginia, November 4th, Amendment 1. Vote for Amendment 1, and it will constitutionally ban assisted suicide from the state of West Virginia.
That's correct. Yes. Thanks for having me on again, Mark and Alex. Appreciate that. Election day is actually November 5th, Tuesday, November 5th. I didn't mean to correct you right off the bat. So the constitutional amendment in West Virginia, the way to amend the state constitution starts with the legislative branch. You get 2/3, a supermajority of votes in either in both the House and the state Senate, and then it gets put on the ballot. Mm-hmm. And the voters have to then approve it at the next general election by a simple majority of over 50%. And so the proposed constitutional amendment, which would prohibit medically assisted suicide in West Virginia, that passed the legislative branch back in March, and it is on the ballot this November. And we are now the only jurisdiction in the entire Western world which is explicitly fighting back against this nihilistic movement of euthanasia against Western men and Western women sweeping the Western world.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important right now. I think the church has gotten very sleepy on this issue. I don't know why. It's just that it's in my conversations with people, it's been trying to wake people up to the fact that this is not medically assisted suicide, physician assisted suicide, euthanasia. This is not something that's merely a Northern Europe problem. It's not merely a Canada problem. It's something that's happening here. And this is really, as I understand it, Pat, this is a preemptive attack. This good defense is a strong offense.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Because we're looking at the signs of the times, and we're looking at these groups like Compassion and Choices, Death with Dignity, who are actively spending money, time, resources, lobbying states to adopt these pro-suicide laws.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely the case. I mean, we can see it across the country. It used to be, it was always those sort of West Coast, very liberal, radical states like Oregon that adopted this first, or one of the first, state of Washington, California, some of the eastern coastal states like Vermont. That's no longer the case. Mm-hmm. Midwestern states now are considering legalizing euthanasia and medically assisted suicide. Kentucky had introduced, that gained a little bit of momentum this past year. Virginia got it past the House of Representatives in their state legislature, but I believe the state Senate didn't approve it. Delaware passed it. And just recently, the governor of Delaware vetoed it, actually. But there's other Midwestern states where these activists from these pro-suicide liberal interest groups are pushing hard. New York is next. They failed to get it across the finish line in New York. But even in places like Ohio, there's a major effort to get it legalized in Ohio. Of course, Virginia already mentioned. Yeah. Maryland's probably going to go next. Yeah. But they're attacking the Midwest. They're attacking the Bible Belt. Mm-hmm. I mean, and they're attacking it with just not euthanasia, but all the other sort of facets that go along with radical, liberal, progressive ideology. Mm-hmm. And they're pushing all of these massive facets of their ideology into the Midwest because they know that this is the last stronghold for a strong Christian culture.
Yeah, you've been doing some research on how this, Alex, that is, you've been doing some research on how this started and sort of the way it's become American, and it's been interesting because it's not in America. The way it's been sold is very much this idea that it's a right that we have. Our individual autonomy is basically under attack by the very possibility of death, by disease, by the indignities that accompany it, and by the fact of just not being able to choose your own death. Mm-hmm. And so the assisted suicide, especially in the beginning when it's being pushed in Oregon, is promoted as almost like a Ubermensch, like new kind of being that man can now, having for so long sort of suffered under the indignity of death being something he can't control. Well, now he can control it. Yeah. Now we have the means for that last moment to be choice, to be an active decision. And so it was all preached as this kind of heroic enlightenment, a technological tale that like we're once again overcoming the limits of human nature because we have medically assisted suicide.
That's definitely right. You could see it in the commercials that these groups push: death with dignity, compassionate choices. I saw a commercial that was sponsored by one of the two groups that had a lot of females and males on a beach, and they were just basking in the glory, and they had signed up for the euthanasia laws, and they were looking at the stars, and they said, how beautiful it is, and how beautiful will my death be, because I'm choosing it. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of just sort of kumbaya music in the background of the commercial, and in the last line was, it will be so beautiful if you only have the courage to choose this beauty of ending your life. And it's so dystopian.
Yeah,
right?
You can't make it up.
But it goes with what you're saying is that they are essentially implicitly projecting themselves as godlike figures.
Well, they say it's autonomy, and that's kind of the commercial reality of it. But in 2019, the National Council on Disability released this 70-page document going through all these cases, showing how it's not... you can imagine it as being autonomous, but when the person is terminally ill and dying, there's just all these pressures around them. And when you introduce physician-assisted suicide, they go through cases of people who were basically contacted by their insurance when they were trying to get chemotherapy or end-of-life care, and their insurance in places like California and Oregon just denied them coverage for treatment. They needed chemotherapy to live. But because it was legal to go through with physician-assisted suicide, they said, have you considered killing yourself, basically, instead of us covering you?
Yeah,
and it's just terrifying because instead of treatments that will prolong your life, will help your suffering, insurance companies now have an option to deny you coverage for this other treatment, which is you just dying.
Autonomy, baby.
Yeah, so autonomy and a big idea, but in practice it's...
Oh, and it got so bad in California, they had to make a law that an insurance company cannot offer to pay for your suicide pills and deny you coverage in the same form of communication. Now what they do is they use two different forms of communication. So you'll get a letter saying, sorry, you've been denied palliative care, and then a call from the insurance company that'll say, hey, we'll cover your suicide. Now they say it much nicer than that, but we don't like using that language around here.
Right, yeah, they're not going to call it suicide.
No, it's why they, Compassion and Dying renamed itself Compassion and Choices.
Right.
Hey, here's two things you like. Compassion, choices.
Right.
What do we stand for? Killing your grandma, but that gets kind of brushed under the rug with that rhetoric.
Yeah. Little nifty corporate branding.
Yeah. It's like the worst of the PR culture. The way they, or the HR sort of language, the way they mask what they're about.
But that's true what you're saying, Alex, because when you go take a look at states like California and Oregon, what you're going to see is that palliative care is not so profitable. And doctors are strapped with different cases. Sometimes they're overworked, and a lot of times they want to focus on the most profitable things. I would have to say the most profitable operations in California probably come from Hollywood and all the celebrities going to their favorite plastic surgeons. That's what they want to really focus on, right? They don't want to focus on things that are cheap, that aren't going to really pay off, like hospice or like some other long-term sort of treatment plans. No, it's easy for them to recommend the suicide pills, just do away with the patient, free themselves from that, and then focus their resources on things that can really make a buck and bring in the cash. And that's what we're really seeing, you know. And insurance companies operate the same way. As soon as this is introduced, suddenly it's all about the bottom line. Why the heck am I going to cover chemo therapy and chemo treatment for someone that was diagnosed with colon cancer, who's not terminal? It could very likely go into remission, when I can simply prescribe suicide pills and to move on to some more profitable surgeries or more profitable types of industries. And the insurance companies, or escape the cost, right? They avoid it. It's all about the bottom line. And we just continue to see this kind of line of thinking. And it goes back to actually Oregon. You know, every single time that medically assisted suicide is introduced and then legalized, it's always pitched to the voters or to the legislators by these groups that, oh, it's only for, you know, that one guy out there or that one elderly person, and he only has like 2 hours left to live. You know, I mean, his organs are falling apart. He's just in so much pain. Just have compassion. He's only got 2 or 3 hours. Yeah. It's over. So just allow us to give him the poison pills and put him out. Put him out of his misery. And that's never the case. Mm-hmm. What ends up happening is they pitch it that way, but it's always broadened. Right, like in Oregon.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that they broadened it in Oregon was a basically tacit redefinition of terminal. Right. So they brought it in and said, look, this is just for terminal cases, meaning you have less than 6 months to live. And so, I mean, I think it's still evil. And this is part of the problem, is like, it's all bad. And so, well, we can talk more about that. But the 6 months to live, right, that's the appeal. But then it gets defined by people as a terminal illness being one that would kill you in 6 months if you don't take medication, if you refuse treatment.
Precisely.
So that's so many. I mean, you can have a gastrointestinal problem that if you don't treat it, you might only have something like 6 months to live. And there's no guarantees. I mean, people outlive their diagnosis.
If you don't eat
all
food
the time
for 6 months.
Well, you're
anorexia.
There was 8 cases, I think 8 or 9 cases of anorexia in Oregon recently that were terminal illnesses under that same logic that, well, if you don't treat them, then it's terminal. Therefore, you can prescribe suicide as a solution to the problem. Of course, it's not a solution to the problem. It's just killing the person who has the problem instead of treating them, which is beneficial to insurance companies. And I'll say it just becomes a way of solving all sorts of social problems that have been out of the reach of sort of centralizing-minded liberals for so long. I mean, we look at Canada as a good example. I was just reading this story of...
Let me say something real quick about what you brought up about Oregon. The constituent I had got a bad diagnosis, colon cancer. Had no pain, went to the doctor. They said you had colon cancer. If you take this treatment and follow this rigorous course that we're going to prescribe for you, there's a chance it could go into remission. He talked to some doctors in Portland. You know, he's from around here. He was one of my constituents. He talked to some doctors in Oregon who, by the way, they not only expanded the law out there, the medically assisted suicide law in the way you said, but they also recently expanded it to all non-residents of Oregon, right? So he could fly there and stay at a death hotel, and then that's what he did, and received the poison pills. But they told him, don't receive any treatment. Deny any treatment for your colon cancer, and we'll just sign off on that you only have 6 months left to live. We don't know really, but they have all these death doctors that are dedicated to this in conjunction with their insurance companies.
Totally.
To just rubber stamp this and say, yeah, you're going to die in 6 months if you don't receive any treatment for your colon cancer, if you don't receive any treatment for your liver disease, if you don't receive any treatment for anorexia.
Yeah.
And so they've already widened the law.
Totally.
And so there's no way really it's all ambiguous. You cannot define really that narrow sort of patient, that you want to put down like Old Yeller in the last 2 months of the life, or last 2 days, And the people that are advocating for this, one of the arguments they always makes, and it's the most foolish, and it really just pisses me off, to tell you the truth, is they reduce men and women to animals. Hey, we put animals down with euthanasia.
Right.
You're saying we can't relieve the suffering of grandma and grandpa in the same way?
Yeah. And one of the things that's so beyond the obvious dehumanization that does, and let's be clear, it does not stop outside of the doctor's office. It's like if you dehumanize people, if you make that something that's allowed among your people, then your children are going to grow up in a dehumanized culture. Right? It doesn't stop. This is the silly idea that you can be kind of bad in one place, but then have no bad effects. That's the one of the biggest illusions that I think people suffer under here. And it's like, no, actually, if children grow up in a culture where grandma and grandpa can be put down, then they're going to be less compassionate people. They're going to be more calculating people. Life's going to have a price tag for them. Yeah. But what I wanted to say, one of the ways to prove what you're talking about is just to go to Oregon's own.
You could see that with war veterans, by the way.
How's that?
You could see that with war veterans, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
You go to combat and you operate predator drones that are killing men and children,
Yeah.
You can't come back and just compartmentalize that.
Oh, no.
Right?
Our actions
sort of
matter, yeah.
Same sort of way.
I know. People get so confused as to... There's so much to talk about here, but one of the things people get so confused of is how slippery slope arguments work. It's odd. There's like some kind of taboo against saying that... medically assisted suicide is a slippery slope, even though it obviously is. I think the taboo is there just because it's a winning argument, actually.
Yeah, right.
But one of the things that we know is the way that virtue and vice work. It's like if you allow yourself this little bit of utilitarianism, you allow yourself to say, hey, I know there's a person here, and I know that they have an infinite value that's beyond anything in the world, but I'm going to just treat them like an animal here because, you know what, their misery upsets me and it's difficult. And it's difficult for them and it's difficult for me, and I don't want to answer the hard questions and I don't want to look at my own frailty. Wouldn't it be easier if we just got rid of that? And then you imagine you can just go home and then face other challenges with other people, with the poor, with the hungry, with the needy, with children, and say, oh, but I'm going to have a different attitude then. I'm not going to be utilitarian and calculating. I'm not going to say, hey, this upsets me, so I just want to get rid of the problem no matter what. No. Then I'm going to be concerned and compassionate and listening to the person and affirming that there's an infinite value here. It's like, no, that's not how people work. No. You die as you live.
And it's basically a historical fact at this point, right? Since Oregon legalized it, in 94 and then in 98 it went into law after doing some legal battles. The numbers of people in Oregon receiving it has just increased and increased and increased.
Oh, yeah.
And the widening of terminal illness, what terminal illnesses are, like the treatment clause, like you guys were bringing up, that's all been pulled away. And then recently in Oregon, you don't even have to be an Oregon resident. You can fly there, travel there. And then with Canada, they were considering just mental health. Like if you find any type of if you have any mental distress, depression,
and they include
anything,
addiction problems within mental health too. And they postponed that recently, and they're going to enact it in a year or two because of some of the backlash finally. But they're proceeding to move forward towards that. So not just mental health, but addiction now. If you have addiction problems, that's included in mental health.
It's like this brilliant maneuver. They're going to solve every social problem by killing all the people who have the social problem. Drug addiction, poverty. There was a woman who she could not afford a apartment that was free of like chemical cleaners and cigarette smoke.
And
she had like a bunch of sensitivities to that. Yeah. She couldn't find an apartment that she could afford, that would be a good environment for her. But she did get accepted for euthanasia, so she killed herself. Sure. And it's a strong example, but actually that's just one of many in Canada. I mean, you had a woman whose cost of managing chronic pain was pretty high because she had to pay out of pocket for certain kind of special
credit cards. And,
yep. So she said, and she did, I'm going to use up my credit cards until the credit's gone, and then I'm going to kill myself. And that's what is allowed in that state. But you have to step back and see what's happening here. Well, they're actually solving problems of poverty. They're solving problems of social inequality. They're willing to treat to basically look at things that are solvable by other means and say, no, actually, we're just going to kill the person who has these problems rather than invest in affordable housing or figure out creative ways to make medicine cheaper. Right. Things like this that the left is supposed to be concerned about. Right, like just generally speaking, if you're going to give a good word to the left, you'll say, all right, well, they're concerned about quality of life.
The left and the old Democratic Party was concerned about the average Joe, the working man.
Yeah,
the working gal. They wanted to take care of them with social programs,
the basic condition.
And guess what happens? The radical, progressive, liberal ideology got transformed into something far beyond that, where now it's turned upside down. It's no longer taking care of the person with social programs. The social programs are aimed at killing them, and they don't want to admit that.
Yeah.
And in Canada, let me tell you another thing. Combat veterans, there's several stories. Go look them up. People listening, if you don't believe me, combat veterans in Canada call in to a suicide hotline with social workers, and the social workers offer them medical assistance in dying. Mm-hmm. Combat veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder are calling in to suicide hotlines in Canada, and they're being offered suicide.
Totally.
I mean, what world are we living in? This is a dystopian nightmare, and for people out there listening, don't think that that's not going to increase here.
Yeah. I mean, basically, Canada is a little far ahead of Oregon and what it's doing, but Oregon is is catching up. I mean, one of the ways you can see it is in Oregon. Oregon does questionnaires. The data that they collect is pathetic. I mean, you'd think that in something at the very least as controversial as giving people poison that melts their insides, there would be a lot of data collection about what's going on. But they destroy records after 18 months. They manipulate death certificates to say that everyone who died of medically assisted suicide in fact died of their diagnosis of the terminal disease. So it's like, oh, he's on the floor surrounded in vomit and he died of his cancer. It's like, you know what I mean? Right. It's just like this completely...
And again, going back to how they get around the 6-month to live rule, they didn't die from the terminal disease. They could have been treated. It wasn't terminal until the doctors out there that are death doctors recommended don't get treatment.
Right. But they do these questionnaires, which I'm glad they have something to look at. And what they're finding is, it's actually a very low number of people who list as one of the motivations for picking medically assisted suicide that actually list their illness and the suffering that they're in. And that's, I think, really important because it's always pushed, like you said, as this way to end suffering, right? Because it's the only way that righteousness works in America. Like, you have to be on the side of the person who's suffering, right? You can't be the tyrant, right? You have to be the guy that defeats the tyrant. And so that's how they push it. You're basically letting someone suffer by not having these laws, therefore you're the tyrant. And if you want to fight for freedom, then you will give them what they want. You'll meet their demand. But that's not what it is. So it's like low, I want to say like 35% of people citing suffering as the reason for that's motivating their assisted suicide. But you know what they are citing increasingly?
53%.
Yeah, 53% of people are citing being a burden on others, being a burden on family, being a burden on friends, being a burden on caretakers. Yeah. They're citing that. They're also citing, this loss of autonomy that they're experiencing. They are citing the fact that their life does not have as much joy in it as before, and they're also citing in a major way the fear of the loss of dignity that's going to come upon them as they face death. But it's important to look at those things. those things are not strictly medical problems, right? They're social problems. They're problems that we can intervene in. They're problems that friends and families and neighbors and doctors all have the means. It's like, okay, what is this person scared of? He's scared of being a burden. Okay, well, why don't we tell him you're not a burden? Why don't we get together with someone who's got a terminal diagnosis as family, as friends, and say we love you and we're with you all the way. It doesn't matter, whatever you're going through. The kinds of things that people need to hear, the questionnaires show it. But we refuse to look at medically assisted suicide as a sign of someone crying out for help. We have this magical wand that we wave where any other, I was researching for some of this, and I would type in something that had medically assisted suicide, in the search online. And of course, the first thing you see is all of these suicide prevention hotlines, because you've just triggered it. You've said suicide. Well, now this whole American system of care and concern for you gets evoked. And there they are. They're saying, like, call us. There is hope, right? It's not the end. And that's the first thing you see. And then you scroll down past that and you get the completely opposite message, which is like, interested in medically assisted suicide? Here's where to go. And the challenge that the advocate of assisted suicide has is to make a case, and a convincing one, because it better be convincing, as we're talking about people's lives here, that medically assisted suicide is somehow this other phenomenon that shouldn't be treated with the same preventative stance as suicide. And they have not shown this at all. In fact, all the data points to the fact that medically assisted suicide is a suicide attempt like any other. Yeah. And maybe I can say one thing on that, like the way they pitch it as autonomy. That's how we started this conversation. The way they pitch medically assisted suicide as this like bold claiming of your death at the end of life, a last act of control. Yeah. The lie is so obvious in that case, because what's pretty autonomous is shooting yourself in the head. I'm not saying you should, to be clear. No. I'm just saying, like, the autonomy, the sense of taking something into your own hands belongs to suicide, just generally speaking. Now, in a way, I don't think it is, because I think you're always under pressure in suicide. You're never acting for your own good, right? So there's something deeply slavish about it, deeply unautonomous about it. But at the same time, it's like the push for suicide as a medically assisted phenomenon is the push for a kind of suicide at which all sorts of social pressures can be brought to bear on the individual who is in a very vulnerable state to act in a certain way.
Yeah, and people that pitch this idea and lobby for this idea of medically assisted suicide tend to reduce relationships between the patient and the physician as if they're on some sort of equal footing, as some sort of equal power arrangement. But doctors have an extraordinary amount of authority in our society. I mean, all we got to do is go back and look at COVID. Dr. Fauci was on television every single day, and half the country listened to him like he was, essentially some sort of saint, and anything that came out of his mouth was gospel. And it's not an equal sort of relationship. There is no consensual contract when we're talking about medically assisted suicide between a patient and their doctor. There's a power imbalance there. Totally. And so when a physician just suggests that medically assisted suicide is on the table, suddenly that's a recognized authority figure who's supposedly an expert telling the patient, hey, this is an option, and it plants a seed, even if it's unconsciously done. It plants a seed of doubt in the elderly's head. And then that really causes the burden. And then it can divide families. It can really tear them up because, let's be real, there are many siblings that might not have the best intentions when their parents are reaching that age. Sometimes they don't want to put up with the care anymore, and sometimes they might want an early inheritance. And then when medically assisted suicide's on the table, that just exasperates those family problems that already exist anyway.
Totally.
And, I think that we need to really take a look at this also because, look, we pass laws in the state legislature all the time that protect senior citizens from being scammed by telemarketers and other sorts of scammers on email because of why? Because they're typically not as sharp as they once were. And that gets especially so when senior citizens have dementia or other forms of cognitive diseases. And you're going to tell me that person going into a doctor who's a death doctor who's going to recommend medically assisted suicide, that's some sort of consensual relationship,
Oh my gosh,
not even withstanding the recognized authority that doctor has over that patient.
Yeah.
Just the fact that the elderly and the weak and the disabled normally are at such a disadvantage, even cognitively speaking.
Yeah, and there's a case that the Council for Americans with Disabilities, what's the NDA?
NCD, National Council on Disability.
Right. There's a case they brought up that just shows this. There was a woman in Oregon with dementia, and her daughter brought her to an appointment, and with her mother asked if she could get medically assisted suicide, and the doctor said no. And so the daughter took her to another doctor, and she asked the same question, can she, based on this, get medically assisted suicide? And the doctor said, look, based on your mother does have dementia, but she's not dying. I can't do this. I won't do this. And the daughter got angry. And then she went to a third doctor who was known to prescribe these sorts of things, and she finally got the yes, and they went through with it.
Yeah, they just doctor shop.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about this. One doctor is not, equal to the next. I mean, what do you call the guy that graduates last in his medical school? A doctor, right? Mm-hmm. So you're going to find plenty of doctors out there, once this is legalized, that will specialize in this, and they'll rubber stamp it.
I mean, it was very similar to the opioid crisis that's been such a big part of our world here, that, it was doctors that could stand to do it, who were prescribing opioids when they knew it was hurting people, but they didn't care. And part of the reason for going to the law here is because it protects people against those wicked men, against bad actors who don't have the kind of scruples and concerns. When these laws are introduced, it's as if everyone who's going to utilize them, it just does nothing but care, just like radiates caring for the old, and that is going to be the enactment of a pro-suicide law. But that's not the case. I mean, it's a mixed bag. It always is.
And it's something interesting you found, that it's not as though in Oregon or Washington, California, that it's every doctor's a death doctor is prescribing these things. But there are certain doctors that are the death doctors that people shop for. And what ends up happening is that because the American Medical Association is against physician-assisted suicide. They've made a statement on it.
Right now they are.
Yeah, I mean, now they're right. There's a lot of people trying to.
Yeah.
But most doctors don't want to do that because don't want to recommend assisted suicide because they know that their whole profession is treating people and bringing them to health. But if you're in one of these states and you're a doctor, then there's this added pressure of having to recommend a patient who wants this to someone who will prescribe them. It just introduces a whole. It introduces the bad actors, like you were saying.
Oh, yeah, and it manipulates the spinelessness of the mediocre actors. You know what I mean? It's like you have people like just don't want to deal with the problem. Yeah, they're not rabid for prescribing pain or poison pills, but you know what? They're uncomfortable, and someone's coming in front of them and saying that they want this and they want to kind of go with the flow. I mean, there's a reason to not allow the option at all, because when you have the option,
sure,
then it becomes a temptation.
But even when you have good actors, right? Even when you have doctors that have very high ethical standards, even when you have doctors that have very high ethical standards, once the law is changed and institutionalized medically assisted suicide, the financial interests and pressures, even on the best of these doctors, will be under so much pressure that they will, not all of them, will go with the flow. Because why? Insurance companies, they start taking advantage of this. They won't pay for the treatment. The doctor may not have any other recourse other than prescribe the lethal pills. There's many other different types of treatments that even the good doctors have to devote their time towards. And if the hospital and the healthcare system is pressuring some of these good, virtuous doctors, right, they can turn to vice too, because of the sort of setting now in the formation that the medical institutions are forming them and putting them into. And there's another thing that we need to recognize is the federal debt, the national debt, is exploded past $30 trillion. I think it's approaching $40 trillion. Medicare and Medicaid are very expensive line item tickets in that federal debt. There are many federal politicians that see the spread of medically assisted suicide as a way of finally trying to stabilize the national debt. Because if you can just simply kill an elderly person, then guess what? Medicaid costs are no longer a factor with that person. Medicare costs are no longer a factor. And so it's not only private insurance, but it's the federal programs that treat middle-class people that are seen as cost savings. Mm-hmm. And so this is really a phenomenon that's starting to develop. Mm-hmm. And we think, we're not ever going to be able to tackle that. These people know that they can do this. And you know what? They're targeting the Midwest. That's why you're seeing a surge of these liberal lobbyists representing groups like Death with Dignity and Compassion and Choices going into Midwestern legislators like, Kentucky and Virginia and Ohio, and pushing these. And they're going to have massive campaigns next year. They're going to try to push for between 10 to 15 Midwestern states to get to legalize medically assisted suicide. Mm-hmm. And we got to draw a line in the sand.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. One of the fascinating things that I found out just through researching and thinking about this, and I'd known this to be the case, I just didn't know the extent, is the way that suicide is doing a lot more, and I just mean a suicide attempt, not just medically assisted suicide, but any suicide attempt, is doing a lot more than just simply seeking death the way that a hungry person's seeking a hamburger. And that's how it's characterized when these laws are first sold to us, as just being a right that people have, and why won't you let them use it? But two facts really interested me. One was that for every one suicide in America, there's approximately 25 suicide attempts that don't end in death. Right. That was one. The other statistic that really interested me was that of those people that survive, which is, again, the vast majority of suicide attempts, for those survivors, 70% of them go on to never attempt suicide again. 23% after that do attempt suicide again, but again, don't die. And it's only 7% of people who, after surviving a suicide attempt, go on to die by suicide. Now, that should give us incredible hope.
Right.
And not just because it's like, I'm glad that people aren't, using the right means when they attempt to do this, but because it obviously shows that suicide is not just about death. I mean, we desire to live. It is good to live. And when you approach at any age, but especially when you're reaching old age and you have terminal illnesses, when you approach that desire to die, it's mixed up with a desire to live.
Sure.
It's ambivalent. Now, normally, like in the case of suicide, a suicide is expressing that misery. It's a cry for help. When we do it, it's often with very little planning. I mean, this is another statistic that really fascinated me. The number of suicides where the actual planning is a matter of minutes is pretty incredible.
Yeah.
The idea,
I mean,
go ahead.
It's like you can see videos of law enforcement officers that are approaching, men and women that are standing on a bridge at the end of the rope. They're depressed, something's gone wrong in their life. They're standing on top of a bridge ready to jump, and you see law enforcement officers standing there ready to give their lives to pull this person back.
Yeah.
And they often do, and they grab them, and then they go get help, and they never try it again.
Right,
but you're getting at a different point.
Right,
because we do that, and then on the other hand...
Well, yeah, I mean, the medically assisted suicide makes suicide maximally lethal.
Right.
I mean, there's no surviving it. When you do it, there's no turning back. There's no, like, quote-unquote messing it up. It's pretty much guaranteed that you're going to die. And so we don't have the opportunity that so often happens when people attempt suicide, which is that the very fact that they do it, it lands them into a hospital where people care for them because their vocation is that of healer, that it alerts family and friend who did not know or were ignoring or pushing under the rug what that individual was going through. I mean, there's a great story of a gentleman who requested medically assisted suicide. And then before the pills got delivered to his house, he had some kind of doubts, and he called a hotline. And that...
Was it Michael Freeman?
Yeah, Freeman.
Yeah.
Michael Freeman.
Freeland. Michael Freeland.
I think he was 63 years old at the time, and he spoke with a counselor who got him in touch with a doctor who, for his particular terminal illness, I think it was cancer, was just a great doctor. And they started doing treatment instead. And a really cool part of the story is his friends started to visit him every day. So you see right there was a response where two things were being met. One, the reality of his illness was being met by doctors being doctors, not murderers. And then the reality of his feeling a burden that we talked about, of his of his fear of his loneliness, that was met too. And so he went on to live past his diagnosis. He lived like 2 years, so past that 6-month prediction. He died of natural causes.
Yeah, but he was able to meet with his estranged daughter before he died. He was able to talk with friends again, have some very beautiful moments before his natural death.
Yeah.
And, these are things that are just totally removed and eradicated by medically assisted suicide. And I'll just make another point just to add on to what you're saying. There is a radical push to ensure that not only is it made out to be your choice and there's no ambivalence whatsoever by Death with Dignity, Compassion and Choices, but say you go and visit Oregon, and you talk with some death doctors out in Portland, like my constituent Edward did. You are assigned by these death doctors, social workers or volunteers with these groups, these liberal pro-medically assisted suicide groups, Death with Dignity in the case of Portland, Oregon. And as you wait the week or two, if you're an out-of-state resident in Oregon, to get the doctors to rubber stamp the form, they give you the script, you go down to the pharmacy, they give you a cocktail of poisons, you go back to the hotel or Airbnb in Portland. That's a whole market devoted towards these out-of-state residents to lie down in their bed, take the poison, and kill themselves. These volunteers and these social workers are assigned to you. They keep you isolated. They keep you talking only to them. They keep telling you what a wonderful thing it is. And they sit there and they make sure that you take all the poison cocktail pills to make sure you go through with it. And then most of the funding now that gets pushed into these groups like Death with Dignity they get these people to leave them their inheritance. And that's how the majority of their funding continues. Death with Dignity, Compassion and Choices, the funding they get now mainly comes from the people they talk into killing themselves in suicide states. And they say, isn't this a great movement? You're able to die with dignity. These people are lonely, isolated. They keep them away from friends. When I was calling Edward, it was hard sometimes. He would talk to me, and then I knew someone was in the background, you know. And I talked to him for a good 2 weeks when he flew out from West Virginia on Easter Sunday to Portland, Oregon. 2.5 weeks I talked with him while I was out there, staying at this Death with Dignity hotel. It was an Airbnb. And there was a volunteer with him the entire time, almost like if you were to visit the Soviet Union in the 1980s, you're going to have a trailer, a KGB agent following you around, right? This is the same sort of setup. And they talk these people in, keep them isolated into, this is a great movement to help people like you, all right? It's going to be painless. We're going to get the doctor that we all know that rubber stamps this, and there's plenty of them out in these suicide states. And then once you go down to that local pharmacy and get this script of poison, just like any other medication you would at a local pharmacy, you go back, they sit by your bedside, and they make sure you take it. And I got a phone call the next day from his handler, who worked for Death with Dignity, I believe it was, and left me a message and said, I just wanted to let you know that Edward died yesterday after he got off the phone with you by choosing the way he wanted with his own autonomy. And then she went on to basically insinuate that she won and beat me. Because I felt like at some point I had him talked out of it. At one point, a couple days before he did it, he was considering, you know, flying back with me. I said, I'll fly to Portland. I didn't know this guy, but, you know, he was one of my constituents. And I felt like he was on the cusp of saying, you know what, I got a friend now, you know. I said, I'll come out to Portland. Hey, man, we'll see the sights, you know. We'll take the ferry, you know, go see a couple of things out in the bay. And he was almost willing to accept it. But they have these handlers, and they keep it under the radar. They cremated his body. There was no obituary, nothing in the papers. He was from back here.
Right.
And they keep it on the radar because they know it's so controversial. But they get his inheritance money. And I know this because I've talked with other people that have told me this, that are very experienced in these groups that are fighting against these medically assisted suicide groups. Excuse me. But you know, the bottom line is, once they're able to isolate the individual and keep them lonely, you know, as an atomized individual, they cut off all relations to the external world.
Totally. And you can see how it becomes this self-referential circle where the meaninglessness of your life, it becomes cured almost by people who tell you that what you're doing by killing yourself is contributing to a movement, is a social good. Others are benefiting now from your death. It's become meaningful. So the very thing that kills you, the reason it's so, and one of the main reasons it's so tempting is it takes people who are lonely, who feel like a burden, who feel like they would be better off dead, and it tells them, hey, do this, and you're part of history now. You're part of a revolution towards a like better, you know, it says everything Americans want to hear. Like you're the hero when you do this. And that's palliative. I mean, it's creepy, but it's a therapeutic way of dying because the people that are recommending you kill yourself are also telling you you're a hero for doing so. So it has this kind of closed loop that I think becomes almost possible to exist.
I know this Death with Dignity group got Edward's inheritance. And guess what? I didn't even know this guy before he called me during the Holy Week, actually. I just got out of the regular session last year from the legislature, and it was on a Wednesday. I was actually at a doctor's appointment just getting a checkup, you know, basically from being around a bunch of dirty politicians the entire time, right? But he calls me, random phone call, and, you know, tells me about this problem he's got. We talked and talked. He was a wealthy guy, it turns out. Owned a couple of car dealerships over in Ohio. He left his whole inheritance to this group. And they talked him into it because he was isolated, he was lonely, his parents had died, and he told me all the wealth in the world doesn't matter while I'm at the end. I go, you can get treatment.
Yeah.
But they talked him into getting no treatment.
That's
what he went through with.
One of the ways that you could just prove that that what's really happening is that people who are attempting suicide are being given a maximally lethal means of doing so. Like terminal illness really has not so much to do with it. It's like the way the law is working. But the reason you can tell is because if the people who offer medically assisted suicide were really concerned that they weren't killing anyone who was doing it just as a way of killing themselves, but they were just doing it for people as a way to hasten the death that they knew was coming from their terminal illness, and that was it, then there would be a great incentive to check up on the health, like the psychiatric health of the people coming to them, right? Yeah. Because if someone is depressed and has a history of suicidal attempts, and is coming to you and saying, I want medically assisted suicide, well, that's going to make you stop and say, well, whoa, are you really, is it really a matter of your terminal illness diagnosis, or is this a way that you are attempting suicide? Right. Well, we know that they hardly ever, and it's been a declining number, recommend a patient for psychiatric evaluation. Yeah. It's down to 1%.
Yeah, and that 2023 study that you brought to my attention. 1% is ever referred to for psychiatric evaluation or help or therapy.
Right. Even everything we know about the way depression works, right? Mm-hmm. Everything we know about the way that social power works, we're still willing to say an old person who comes here and asks to die by my hand, they're probably just autonomous individuals who want to exercise their rights. And it's hilarious. We don't do this in any other field. I mean, think about the Me Too movement. The whole point of the Me Too movement, as far as I could tell, was you had people who were being sexually molested in some way, saying, I'm going to speak out. This was wrong. This was unjust. And the argument was like, well, you technically consented to it. But the whole point of the movement was that consent within these unequal conditions of power isn't consent at all. It's like, she consented because she would lose her job if she didn't. Like she was under a duress. She was under a certain constraint. And I think the same sort of thing is happening in medically assisted suicide, where you have people coming to people in power and they're being recommended suicide as a solution to all sorts of problems, and they're being made to feel like heroes for doing so. And then we're turning around saying, like, well, they technically consented. They signed. Right. As if the complexity of the human experience could be reduced to like that. They just said yes.
It's like some sort of common Confederate soldier goes back to Georgia after Sherman burned down the South, and some carpetbagger shows up and says, hey, your farm looks pretty crappy, burned to the ground, but, I'll offer you $10. Would you pay for it? $500? Take it or leave it, pal. You consented. Yeah. Thanks a lot, carpetbagger. But listen, we need to draw a line in the sand. Yeah. All right. We need to get warriors rallied, because we're the only jurisdiction that's fighting back against this nihilist movement that's sweeping the West, and we need to get and mobilize men and good women in West Virginia to vote in favor of Amendment 1. We need to pass this amendment to protect the weak, to protect the disabled, and to bring back finally the code of chivalry that's lost on our age.
Mm-hmm. All right. I think we'll end it right there. Hey, guys, thank you so much for listening to New Polity and to Pat here. Please pray for West Virginia, and we will see you next time.